So, welcome back. As I said, I hate to interrupt great conversations. My name is Bruce Lewinstein. I teach science communication at Cornell, and I'm a member of the roundtable that helped plan this workshop. As we get started, I want to remind you of two things, especially for those people who might be listening in online, that we are using a Twitter hashtag of NAS Interface. It's been very active. There's been a lot of stuff there. And that's also the way that you can send in questions to our panelists as we go. I want to point out that we're talking about the culture of science, and it's important that we try to integrate culture of science with other aspects of culture that have become part of regular culture. And of course, one of the aspects of broader culture is this pressure that males have, some of us, to wear neckties. Now, I only see 2 or 3 other people in the room with science-oriented neckties. Mine's a West Nile. Ivan has a metallography. George has got some kind of sea animals of some sort. There may be others among you, but got to look for every opportunity we can here to do these things. I'm a historian, so let me introduce this panel on frictions and momentum, or challenges and opportunities, if you prefer that language. As a historian, let me introduce it with a little bit of history. For more than 60 years, the organized scientific community has, in fact, been concerned about how to change its own culture to improve public discussion and use of science information. In 1951, the AAAS, in a major restatement of its own goals, added the goal to increase public understanding and appreciation of the importance and promise of the methods of science and human progress. That became one of the goals of a major institution of science. In 1958, the National Science Foundation created its Public Understanding of Science program, which is the direct predecessor of today's Advances in Informal Science Learning that one of our later panelists, Dennis Schatz, is a program officer in. Again, a major funding institution that built it into its work. By the 1960s, these kinds of things were interacting, so that with NSF funding, the AAAS ran a series of activities that came together under the label of understanding. They actually had a newsletter, the Twitter of the day, I guess, that went out and that helped build the links, that once you've got some kinds of institutional frameworks, you can start building links across these things. At that time, the then executive director of AAAS, his name was Dale Wolfley, a psychologist, he proposed that AAAS should set up an office in Hollywood to be able to work with filmmakers. Didn't take root then, but now the National Academies has its Science and Entertainment Exchange program, which does precisely that. So that these things, sometimes these institutional seeds take a little while to grow, but they do. There was tremendous growth in some of the institutionalization through the 1970s. A lot of support from NSF, for example, for creating NOVA, which is one of those institutions now that people think of. AAAS supported the creation of mass media fellows, which now are supported by quite a number of scientific societies, so it's built in there. AAAS also started the magazine Science 80, which became 81, 82, 83, which was part of the popular science boom of the early 80s. Unfortunately, it died in 86, along with some other ones. By this time, though, by the 1980s, it was clear that there was a real need to think about the scientists' own concerns, not just the institutional concerns, but the concerns of the individual scientists. And in 1985, Sharon Dunwoody from the University of Wisconsin, who's did a lot of the early research in this area, she and a colleague published a paper on the barriers that scientists saw to popularization. It's based on a nationwide survey. Not surprisingly, the takeaway conclusion was that there is, quote, "there is little to be gained within science by engaging in the public dissemination of information." But the scientists also agreed that such activity might be, quote, "instrumental in obtaining external rewards, such as research funding." As we've already heard this morning, that's an incentive, the recognition that there's a self-interest here. That survey also identified frictions or barriers that in our language of today's panel we'd call frictions. There was, for example, there was a medical society in Broward County, Florida, that had a rule that prevented doctors from being quoted in media stories without prior approval of the medical association. That was a formal barrier. In other work, Dunwoody and others showed that at that time in the 80s, already more than half of the scientists at a research institution had been contacted by a journalist, on average 4 times. And of those, 75% said that they would be willing to be contacted again. Meanwhile, the incentives for participating were beginning to build up. The political challenges of the 1970s, particularly in the case of science, some of the concern that communities had about allowing recombinant DNA work within their boundaries, that combined with, in the same field, the growth of biotechnology a couple of years later, with the growth of an industry that then needed investment and recruitment and good press, that led to a change in the incentives in favor of communicating with the public. Suddenly it was okay to talk to journalists, at least for some scientists. That same era saw new institutional support for science communication in the form of new science museums and interactive science centers. By the turn of the century, of the current century, the National Academies itself had started the process of creating the Koshland Museum. Now, when May presented her data, when she was using the n-grams, there was a big dip there sometime around the 80s and 90s. I'm not sure quite how my incentives argument that there's increased incentives fits with her n-gram. That's a research question we'll have to come back to. Meanwhile, over this period now, since the 90s, there's clearly been a lot of recurring public concern about issues that deal with the life sciences, such as the cyclically returning concerns about evolution in schools. Starting in the late 90s, the fears about GM foods, which in this country have been mostly allowed by regulatory processes, but not in other countries. Concerns at the beginning of this century about nanotechnology and whether it might, concerns about what it would lead to could lead to rejection. And of course, the widespread opposition to the idea that humans have been a cause of climate change. All of these have led to more understanding within the science community that there is value to the science community as well as to a broader humanity of building science outreach into the cultures of science. One marker of that institutionalization, of course, was, as we already heard, the introduction of the broader impacts criterion at NSF in 1997. That's one example of an institutional incentive. Other funding agencies have added similar kinds of rules, perhaps not as high a profile, but similar there. Brooke, in her introduction, mentioned the issue of resources. In 1994, I estimated that the federal government was probably spending about $75 million a year on public understanding of science programs. There's no easy way to calculate it now. There was no easy way to calculate it then. But based on a quick read of the CoSTEM report, Committee on STEM Education, I'm guesstimating it's about $120 to $150 million at this point, federal government. There are, of course, plenty of other sources for funding for science outreach coming from state governments, from philanthropy, their own individual institutions committing resources. As we've heard, that can happen. By the 2000s, there started to be some new surveys on what individual scientists thought about this. There was a 2005 Royal Society survey in the UK, which showed that almost 75% of UK scientists had taken part in some kind of public communication activity within the previous 12 months. And that was an 18% increase over a benchmark that they had established in 2000. Even among those who hadn't participated, 50% said that they would. We did a small replication of that survey at Cornell a couple of years later, and we found that 91% of the life scientists that we contacted said that they had participated in a public event in the previous year. That included school visits and parents going into parent night and saying, my job is to be a scientist. But that survey led to new incentives. So our biotech center established a $10,000 research support prize for the group that within their center that was doing the best job of presenting at a public symposium. Both the Royal Society and our survey certainly identified the same kinds of frictions that we'd seen before. As Brooke noted, the need to spend time on research. We also heard this morning, all of the speakers talked about, I think all of them used the language of their day job, implying that outreach was something that they were adding on top of it, doing instead of rock climbing or windsurfing or something like that. That clearly time constraint is a friction. The issue of disapproval from peers showed up in the surveys, and the lack of significant funding. There are also signs of momentum, such as the Public Engagement Awards that Nalini and Daniel have both won. There are awards not just from AAAS, but from other organizations as well. We've heard about beginning discussions about changes in tenure and promotion rules from May. I know Dietram at the University of Wisconsin is talking about some of those things. There's clearly an increased demand for teaching of the skills of communication. That's what's driving Compass as an organization and the workshop that we had last week on science communication training. Here in DC, there's an emerging network of different scientific societies